Hello travelers, I am Krotnip. This is the logbook of a simple Lindwurm traveler, and today we are going to be continuing my beginner-friendly series Welcome to Lindwurm, and the topic of the day is going to be terrain in Warcrow. To anyone with any wargaming background, terrain as an important facet of the game is probably a familiar thing. If you are walking around a gaming facility or maybe a convention hall and you chance upon wargaming tables, chances are that the terrain is the first thing that you will take note of, and only after that will you swoop in closer to take a look at the models themselves. We may come for the models, and those are the most important part of a wargame. But when it comes to the aesthetics, the terrain comes to many of us as close second, and some may even argue that the terrain is more important than the models, since if you have a amazing looking table, you can immerse yourself in the world, even if your models aren't fully painted or painted to a masterful level. The terrain also not only helps to set the mood for the game and tell a story, but it also acts as a challenging variable that the players have to play around and game with, and in this way we can find ways to gain an advantage over our opponent and prove our worth as commanders of our little toy soldiers. The world of Warcrow is a high fantasy setting, so that means that you can let yourself loose when it comes to creating and utilizing terrain. If you have a fantasy epic movie that's your favorite, you can draw inspiration from there. If there are, let's say, for example, computer games that you played when you were younger or now, you can draw some inspiration from there also. And obviously the source book for Warcrow is a great place from which you can find terrain ideas to explore and implement. Okay, let's get to the nitty-gritty of terrain in Warcrow. The first thing to take note of when approaching the terrain of Warcrow is that when it comes strictly to the game mechanics side of the game, Warcrow is effectively played in a two-dimensional environment, meaning that it's way more important to have clear boundaries for your terrain that then affect the game state rather than what's on top of those boundaries. And theoretically, you might be able to get away with playing with just 2D terrain, like the one I have pictured there. The mousepad terrain will give you all the dimensions that you need to make the game technically happen. Obviously, this doesn't mean that we have to or indeed want to play in a visually two-dimensional environment, and it's probably going to be a priority for many of us to construct or buy terrain that we can then use to spice up the visual look of the battlefield and immerse ourselves into the world of Lindwurm. If you come from a background of a war game which incorporates height of terrain and in essence three-dimensional gaming, like Corvuspelli's very own Infinity, you might at first find this 2D technicality a bit jarring. But if you come from a background of another war game that incorporates this type of relationship with terrain, such as for example War Machine, you know that this type of system isn't inherently better or worse than a 3D environment. It's different. And I very much feel that a war game has to make a decision whether to go for a 2D or 3D terrain based on what the game is about and how the game is constructed. And so far from my experience with Warcrow, I fully agree that the 2D approach is really excellent. If you are able to get or produce for example, cardboard cutouts of terrain, such as those that can be found when you purchase the Winds from the North battle pack, or mousepad terrain, such as I have a display here. Those can be a easy and cheap way to start playing terrain in Warcrow. And then if you feel like it, then you can construct suitable terrain pieces to fit on top of those. I find this setup personally to be the most advantageous, since it offers you the excellent playability of removing the 3D piece of terrain in order to put the models on the 2D cardboard or mousepad terrain pieces, but at the same time you get the full aesthetic experience of creating your own fantasy terrain and then placing it on the battlefield. When I, for example, move my unit of orc hunters into the forest that you see there, I remove the forest piece of terrain from the battlefield, and once the hunters leave the said forest, then I will just replace the forest there, and the aesthetic damage of the functionality is minimized. Another important facet of terrain is adjacency. Most of the effects that the terrain has hinge on the unit touching it or being adjacent to it. And if we are trying to figure out what terrain a unit is adjacent to, we need to take a look at the unit leader model. If the unit leader model is touching a piece of terrain, then we say that the unit as a whole is adjacent to the terrain, which may or may not mean something by itself, as we are going to find out. And if the unit leader model is completely within the bounds of the terrain, then we say that the unit is inside the terrain. So these are the two important terms and conditions that you need to remember going forward. Here is a screen grab taken from the PDF version of the rulebook that you can find on the Warcrow webpage. I really enjoy how Korvuspelli has decided to format this terrain section. This very table is extremely handy for referencing what the terrain does. So take a look at the rulebook's page 345 and refer to that page whenever you need to figure out what a certain piece of terrain is going to do. On the rightmost column, you will be seeing the dimensions of the terrain that Korvuspelli's design team is arguing that you should be using, but as a certain very famous pirate put it, take these as guidelines more than as actual rules. Let's talk about some of the most important keywords and their implications when it comes to terrain. I'm not going to be going through the entire list of terrain elements. You can figure out what's what and how to take best advantage of each one as your experience with the game grows, but let's go through the keywords so we have the basics covered at least. Let's start by taking a look at the block loss keyword. Units cannot draw line of sight through, into, or out of terrain that blocks line of sight. Remember that in Warcrow, for two units to have line of sight to one another, the unit drawing the line of sight has to use its leader as the point of view model, and then they have to be able to draw a straight line to at least half of the models in the target unit for there to be line of sight. This means that there is a possibility where, for example, you have an entire unit basically hunkered down in a forest from into which the opponent cannot see, but your unit leader model is poking partially or even fully out of the forest. In a case like this unit occupying the forested area will be able to see out from the base of their leader, but as the enemy units will be unable to draw line of fire to at least half of your troops, your unit will at the same time be effectively hidden. So forests placed in key parts of the battlefield should probably be quite important areas to occupy with this in mind. Another classic example of line of sight blocking terrain are buildings and small structures. These are the more traditional obstacles type terrain pieces that stop both movement and line of sight. And they are something that you can effectively hide your troops behind. If you are able to use line of sight blocking terrain to hide your troops, that means that they will be safe from enemy charges, ranged attacks and spells that require line of sight. Also take note that there are skills that don't require and abilities that don't require line of sight, and for example our unit in hiding in the forest from previous would be safe from enemies charging them, but they would not be safe from enemies assaulting them, or for example using a special skill to place themselves into melee with the said unit. The line of sight is also broken by this type of terrain between allied units. So if you are looking to, for example, cast a spell at a friendly unit, remember that a line of sight is usually a requirement for the spell, so you have to be on the lookout for those situations and plan accordingly. The next keyword, and one that rules wise or terrain wise comes up quite often, is cover. Cover is gained when a unit is adjacent to a cover providing terrain and they also fulfill a secondary requirement. If both requirements are met, then the unit gaining the cover will be able to add the defensive dice indicated by the cover keyword when they are the target of ranged attacks and spells that act as ranged attacks. In the case of terrain that does not block line of sight, like for example fences and barricades and stuff like this, the secondary requirement, in addition to your unit leader being adjacent to said terrain, is the fact that the enemy has to draw their line of sight to at least half of the unit over the said terrain piece. Take note that this effectively means that if, let's say, we have a wall that's facing towards your opposing unit, that's about to activate and let's say shoot at your unit, make a ranged attack against your unit. You can have your unit leader on the side of the obstacle that the enemy is also on, and hence effectively quote unquote in the open, but as long as they touch the base of the said barricade or wall, they count as being adjacent, and then if at least half of your unit is behind the said fence or barricade and the enemy has to draw line of fire to them, you do gain cover. So you can game the system a bit in this way. If we are talking about a terrain that also has the block line of sight keyword or characteristic, then you only gain the cover if the set terrain piece blocks line of sight to at least half of your unit. The wonky or weird interaction that comes from this is the fact that, as noted previously, line of sight is only had if the leader of the activating unit or the unit checking line of sight has a clear line to at least half of the unit in question. So effectively gaining cover from a line of sight blocking piece of terrain requires that the attacking model sees exactly half of the defending unit. And in both cases, when the requirement is considered, there's also a rounding up closure in the rules, which means that if you see more than half of the unit, then the unit will not be able to receive cover, and if you see less than half of the unit, then you can't see them, period. So no ranged attacks for you. So effectively models are gaining cover from pieces of terrain that block line of sight only when exactly half of the unit is being seen by the attacker or a no line of sight characteristic is involved in the attempt. The way that the line of sight blocking terrain and cover interact also effectively means that line of sight blocking terrain will never provide cover for single model units, and this can seem a bit counterintuitive. Let's see if this is actually something that's very much intentional or something that we are going to be having changed or FAQ'd at some point. Next we have impassable terrain, which is your box standard obstacle type pieces. As the name implies, impassable terrain is impossible to move into or through, and you also can't place any models into the said type of terrain. These terrain pieces thus create effectively obstacles for your troops to move around. They can be used to funnel troops into certain areas of the battlefield or potentially to deny access to others. Not all impassable terrain is created equal, however, as some also block line of sight, like small structures and buildings, and these can be used to screen your troops as they advance, or indeed you can hide behind them without the enemy usually being able to affect you. Then again, if we are talking about impassable terrain that lacks the block line of sight keywords such as lakes, these types of pieces will stop movement, but they will do nothing to hinder line of sight. So a lake might, for example, be used to screen a missile unit so that they can stay out of reach for enemy melee combatants, while at the same time they can fire over the said lake at their enemies. Technically, there is an open door in the future for certain units to be able to move into and use impassable terrain, since the preferred terrain rule allows the unit in question to ignore keywords imposed by their favorite type of terrain. So time will tell whether that's something that we will have to be contending in the future. The next type of terrain that we will be coming across is rugged terrain. This category includes different types of broken ground that will hinder movement to all or at least some units. Touching a piece of rugged terrain will impose the slowed state on the unit in question, which will then hinder their further movement or charging, for example. Speaking of charging, rugged terrain can never be charged through, so this means that this type of terrain can be used to screen your units and protect them from incoming attacks by the enemy. Notice though that assaulting through rugged terrain is allowed, so keep a lookout for enemies that have gotten close enough to you to perform said assault. Note that while rivers, ruins and rugged terrain are always considered rugged, regardless of your unit type, dense forests are rugged only for cavalry and column units to be released in the future, so look out for chances to take advantage of this discrepancy. Also, some to be released units also have the preferred terrain rugged special rules, such as the Tundra Marauders of the Northern Tribes soon to be released, and these types of units will not only be able to ignore the keywords of rugged, so no slowed, and the ability to charge through said terrain, but they will also be able to gain +2 strides to their move or charge as long as they begin it adjacent to said type of terrain. Okay, now that we have gone through the most important types of terrain in a quick succession, let's take a look at how the terrain should be placed on the battlefield. The rules on the page 310 of the rulebook will detail how the terrain should be laid out, but the description on the rulebook is rather vague. It gives you a more or less look on what types of terrain and how many terrain pieces you should be including, and it also lays out a few rules on how not to place terrain. For example, it's advised that no terrain piece should be within 5 strides of an objective and not within 2 strides of another terrain, which in effect facilitates movement between terrain pieces. But at the same time, there is a lot of wiggle room among the rules for placing terrain, how much and where to place it. So I'm expecting us to receive more detailed instructions in the future, maybe as a part of the competitive play package for Warcrow when the day comes that such a package will be released. My best advice as of right now is to talk with your opponent on how to decide what types of terrain to place and how many pieces of terrain to have. One way to solve this might be that you agree to use the cardboard terrain that comes from the Winds from the North battle box, and then as you take turns placing terrain, you can choose whether to place the cardboard this way up or that way up, since every piece has like 2 different types of terrain on it depending on which side up do you deploy them. The buildings obviously are always buildings, but the rest you can choose what they will be representing. Once you have agreed with your opponent how to select the terrain pieces that will be available for your game and how many are you going to be deploying, an interesting pre-game starts. I really enjoy the idea that the game of Warcrow begins even before deployment, since once you have rolled for initiative, you then start placing the terrain in turns, and in this way you are already playing the game when you are placing the terrain and preparing the battlefield. In this phase of the game, the advantage will be on the player who does not have initiative on the first game round, since they are the one who's going to be getting to choose who will place the first piece of terrain, and they will also eventually be the ones who will decide what table site to deploy on. At face value, this feels like a really powerful advantage. You can place those pieces of terrain safe in knowledge that you will be the one to choose the deployment zones, so you can place terrain that will impair your opponent as they try to play the mission and achieve their objectives, and at the same time you can lay terrain that will facilitate your own plans. For example, if you're planning on using units with the scout ability, you can place a forest next to the table edge to facilitate their safe access to the battlefield near objectives or the back lines of your enemy. So a few final words for terrain for now. The terrain in Warcrow is a really important part of the tactical dimension of playing, and it should not be glossed over in this regard. But at the same time, the terrain isn't something that you should be stressing about, especially when you are starting with the game. The starter set will provide you with enough cardboard terrain to play the game as a full experience, and then you can decide whether you are going to be sticking with this easy to transport, easy to use methodology of playing terrain, or whether you are the type of person who will allow their creativeness to reign supreme and decides to construct the most amazing pieces of terrain that you can imagine and then construct. Keep in mind though, when indulging your creativeness, the fact that when it comes to most types of terrain, you are expected to be able to place models on specific positions of the terrain. For example, if you take a look at the forest template pictured here, there is a big importance on where the or counter leader is placed, and if the terrain does not facilitate smooth placement, then it's not exactly playable in the way that Warcrow is supposed to be played. But if, for example, you have a base around which you can move the elements of the terrain, or you can remove the entire terrain piece and just leave a 2D cutout in its place, then you can have the best of both worlds. Work with your opponent when it comes to choosing the amount of terrain to use, the piece of terrain to use, and how to construct a battlefield that both tells a story, because that's at least part of why we are here, and makes for a challenging and interesting game of Warcrow. So at this point I'm going to send you off by wishing you the best of time immersing yourself in the world of Lindwurm and experiencing the multitude of battlefield scenarios and stories you are about to face. So goodbye for now.